The room went quiet the moment the laughter cut through the air. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't surprised laughter. It was the kind of laughter that comes from arrogance, loud, confident, dismissive. A tall man stepped forward, arms crossed, eyes scanning Bruce Lee from head to toe like he was inspecting something unimpressive. "You're not a real fighter," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No trophies. No championships. No titles worth mentioning." He shook his head and smirked. "Just movie tricks. Flashy moves for the camera." A few people chuckled. Others nodded, relieved that someone had said what they were thinking. This wasn't a movie set. No lights. No script. No second takes. This was a private room filled with experienced martial artists, men who had spent years breaking knuckles, earning scars, and clinging tightly to traditions passed down like sacred law. To them, fighting had rules. Fighting had structure. Fighting had approval. And Bruce Lee didn't fit any of it. He stood there quietly, wearing simple training clothes, his frame lean, relaxed, almost unimposing. No belt to display. No medals to flash. No ego demanding attention. The insult hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Everyone waited for Bruce to defend himself, to argue, to list accomplishments, to raise his voice. But he didn't. Bruce Lee didn't say a word. Instead, he slowly rolled his shoulders, loosened his wrists, and shifted his feet just slightly, a subtle adjustment most people didn't even notice. But the room felt it. Something changed. His breathing slowed. His eyes sharpened. The calm on his face wasn't weakness, it was control. The man who laughed felt confident. Too confident. He mistook silence for surrender. "You see," he added, grinning at the crowd. "Nothing to say." Bruce finally looked up. Not with anger. Not with pride. But with a quiet certainty that made the closest men feel uneasy without knowing why. 10 seconds, the challenger had said earlier. 10 seconds to prove himself. Bruce Lee gently raised his hands into position. No announcement. No warning. No dramatic pose. Just readiness. And in that instant, before anyone could blink, before anyone could rethink their words, the truth was about to strike faster than sound itself. 10 seconds later, every single person in that room would realize something chilling. They hadn't just underestimated Bruce Lee. They had completely misunderstood what a real fighter looks like. It was a closed-door martial arts gathering in the early 1960s, the kind of meeting that didn't appear in newspapers or posters. No spectators, no publicity, only practitioners who believed they represented the highest level of combat knowledge. The room smelled of sweat, incense, and polished wood. This was sacred ground to them, a place where tradition ruled and change was treated like disrespect. The fighters stood in clusters, each group defined by lineage rather than ability. Styles were worn like uniforms. Stances were rigid, movements rehearsed, philosophies memorized word for word from teachers long gone. Every man there believed his way was the right way, not because it worked best, but because it had always been done that way. In their eyes, tradition was power. And then there was Bruce Lee. He stood apart from the groups, not out of arrogance but because there was no group he belonged to. No rigid style. No single master's shadow hanging over him. He was lean, almost deceptively so, his body relaxed, his posture natural. He didn't look like the champions they were used to. He didn't look like someone who needed to prove anything. That alone made him suspicious. Whispers followed him as he moved across the room. "He's too fast for his own good. He doesn't respect form. All that motion, no discipline." They watched him stretch, fluid and loose, not stiff like the others. To them, looseness meant lack of control. They didn't understand that it was the opposite. One senior fighter finally stepped forward. He was older, broad-shouldered, his face marked by years of hard training and harder beliefs. He crossed his arms slowly, deliberately, a gesture meant to establish dominance before words were even spoken. "Kung Fu is about tradition," he said, his voice steady and firm. "About respect. About preserving what our masters gave us." He looked directly at Bruce. "What you do is not real fighting." The statement wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried weight because everyone in the room agreed with it. Heads nodded. Faces tightened with approval. In their world, breaking tradition was the same as disrespecting it. Bruce listened carefully. Then he smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not a defensive one. Just a polite, almost gentle expression that caught the senior fighter off guard. Bruce wasn't offended. He wasn't challenged. He was observing. To him, fighting was not about repeating the past. It was about efficiency, honesty, and adaptation. But explaining that to men who had already decided he was wrong would be pointless. The tension in the room grew thicker by the second. Everyone sensed that something was coming, not because Bruce looked aggressive, but because he looked ready. Ready in a way they didn't recognize. And before we go any further, comment below where you're watching from, and if you respect discipline over ego, hit that like button so this story reaches more warriors who understand that true strength begins with humility. Oncoming fist. Bruce Lee adjusted his breathing and shifted his weight, barely noticeable movements that spoke louder than words. He wasn't here to argue philosophy. He was here to demonstrate truth. And the men who clung so tightly to old rules were about to learn something they never expected, that evolution doesn't destroy tradition. It exposes its limits. The challenger stepped forward. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, built like a man who had spent years conditioning his body to absorb punishment and deliver it twice as hard. His stance was wide and grounded, feet planted with the certainty of someone who had never been pushed backward. Confidence rolled off him effortlessly, not the loud kind, but the quiet assurance of a man who had won enough fights to believe he couldn't lose this one. 10 seconds, he said, his voice calm but edged with superiority. If you can touch me, I'll admit I'm wrong. A murmur rippled through the room. 10 seconds wasn't an offer. It was an insult. In that time frame, real combat rarely even began. To the challenger, it was a way of saying, you won't even get close. He expected Bruce to hesitate, to overthink, to fail before he even moved. The crowd leaned in instinctively, forming a loose circle around the two men. No one spoke now. This wasn't a friendly demonstration anymore. It was a test. A line had been drawn between tradition and evolution, and everyone wanted to see which would fall first. Some faces showed excitement. Others showed doubt. A few already looked uncomfortable, as if they sensed this wasn't going to unfold the way they expected. Bruce Lee stepped forward as well, matching the distance without copying the stance. His feet weren't locked in place. His knees weren't stiff. He didn't mirror the challenger's posture because he didn't need to. His body was loose, balanced, alive, like a coiled spring that didn't look tense until the instant it was released. Bruce exhaled slowly. Not to calm nerves, there were none. Not to prepare a technique, there was no fixed plan. It was focus. His breath settled deep, steady, controlled. His eyes didn't fixate on the challenger's face or fists. They softened, taking in everything at once: shoulders, hips, balance, intention. Bruce wasn't looking at a man. He was reading a system. Across from him, the challenger misread the moment entirely. He mistook stillness for hesitation, relaxation for weakness, silence for uncertainty. "You ready?" the man asked, almost bored. Bruce nodded once. Nothing else needed to be said. Someone near the back checked a stopwatch. Another man raised his hand slightly, ready to signal the start. The air in the room felt tight, charged, like it was holding its breath along with the crowd. The signal came. And in that first fraction of a second, something subtle happened. The challenger shifted his weight forward, preparing to advance. He intended to control the center, to pressure Bruce into retreat, to show dominance through presence alone. It was a solid plan, against someone who followed rules. But Bruce Lee didn't. Bruce moved as the intention formed, not after the movement began. His body responded to the challenger's thought before the thought could become action. There was no wind-up, no telegraph, no wasted motion. To the crowd, it looked like nothing had happened. And then it looked like everything had happened at once. A step, a blur, a sudden displacement of air. The challenger felt it before he saw it, a sharp change in pressure inches from his face, a presence that hadn't been there a heartbeat earlier. His eyes widened as his body reacted on instinct, muscles tightening too late. Bruce stopped his strike a hair's breadth from contact. Close enough that the challenger could feel the heat. Close enough to understand. Time seemed to slow, not because the moment was long, but because the realization hit hard. Bruce could have hit him, could have dropped him, could have ended the conversation violently. But he chose control. The room froze. No one checked the stopwatch anymore. No one breathed. The challenger swallowed, his confidence draining into disbelief as his mind replayed what his body had failed to stop. He had trained for years to react quickly, yet he hadn't even seen the attack. 10 seconds hadn't passed. Not even close. And in that suspended silence, one truth became painfully clear to everyone watching. This wasn't about strength. This wasn't about tradition. This wasn't about proving dominance. This was about reality. And reality had just moved faster than they were prepared to understand. The signal was given. There was no countdown, no dramatic pause, no shouted command to begin. Just a subtle motion of a hand, a nod from the side of the room, and that was enough. In a real confrontation, there are no ceremonies. Only opportunity. In less than a blink, Bruce moved. Not fast in the way people expect fast to look. There was no explosion of muscle, no exaggerated leap forward. His body flowed, weight shifting effortlessly, feet gliding across the floor with quiet precision. It was speed without tension, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already finished. To the crowd, it registered as a blur. One moment Bruce stood just outside range. The next, he was inside it. A single step erased distance. A single motion collapsed the space between them. The challenger barely had time to register the change before instinct screamed at him to react. His shoulders twitched, hands rising a fraction too late, muscles locking as his mind struggled to catch up with what his eyes hadn't yet processed. Bruce's strike came like a whip. Straight. Direct. Economical. There was no wasted motion, no flourish meant to impress. His fist cut through the air so cleanly it produced a sharp crack, the sound of pressure being displaced in an instant. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The kind of sound that makes trained men flinch because they know exactly what it means. Then Bruce stopped. His knuckles hovered inches from the challenger's face. Not close enough to touch. Not far enough to doubt. The distance was deliberate, a silent statement of control more powerful than impact. Bruce wasn't showing how hard he could hit. He was showing that he didn't need to. The challenger froze. His eyes widened, pupils dilating as adrenaline surged through his body with nowhere to go. His breath caught in his chest, half inhaled, half forgotten. He could feel the presence of the strike like heat on his skin, like the echo of danger passing just close enough to be felt. He hadn't even seen it coming. There had been no warning sign, no shoulder drop, no shift he could read in time. His training, all of it, had prepared him to react to motion. But Bruce had moved before motion became visible. The room went dead silent. Not the respectful silence of an audience. The stunned silence of witnesses. Every man in that room understood what they had just seen, even if they couldn't explain it. This wasn't speed they could copy. This wasn't technique they could memorize. It was something deeper, an understanding of timing so precise it bordered on instinct. Bruce held the position for a fraction of a second longer. Long enough for the message to land. Long enough for the challenger to feel it. Then he relaxed his arm and stepped back, returning to his original distance as if nothing had happened. No heavy breathing. No tension left behind. His posture remained loose, balanced, calm. The contrast was striking. The challenger stood rigid, body locked in the aftermath of shock. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that his defenses had never existed in that moment. His mind replayed the sequence again and again, searching for the mistake. There was none. Bruce hadn't broken a rule. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't relied on surprise alone. He had simply been faster, not in movement, but in perception. Around them, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some men looked at their hands, flexing their fingers as if questioning everything they thought they knew about reaction time. Others exchanged glances, unspoken questions passing between them. If that had been real, if that strike hadn't stopped, No one finished the thought out loud. Because they didn't need to. The truth had already struck. Bruce Lee hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't challenged anyone's honor. He hadn't claimed superiority. Yet in a single, controlled moment, he had rewritten the rules of the room. And the most unsettling part wasn't how fast he had moved. It was how effortlessly he had done it. The man swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, his mouth suddenly heavy, as if his body was still catching up to what his mind had just witnessed. He took a step back without realizing it, boots scraping softly against the floor. The distance he had been so confident about moments earlier now felt dangerously small. "That," he said, then stopped. He tried again, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier certainty. "That wasn't technique." The room leaned in, every ear straining to catch his words. "That was instinct." There was no shame in his tone now. No mockery. Just honesty, raw and uncomfortable. He wasn't conceding a point for politeness. He was admitting something far worse to his ego, that everything he thought defined real fighting had just been bypassed completely. Bruce lowered his hand. The motion was simple, unremarkable, but it carried weight. He hadn't frozen the strike to intimidate. He had frozen it to teach. Now that the lesson had landed, there was no need to hold the pose any longer. He met the challenger's eyes, calm and steady. "Fighting isn't about styles," Bruce said quietly. "It's about truth." The words didn't echo, but they settled into the room like gravity. No one interrupted. No one argued. They couldn't. The truth had already been demonstrated, and arguments feel hollow when reality has spoken first. For years, the men in that room had trained to perfect forms, memorizing sequences, repeating movements until they became ritual. They believed mastery lived in tradition, in lineage, in doing things exactly as they were taught. And yet, what Bruce had shown them didn't reject training. It transcended it. He hadn't abandoned discipline. He had refined it. The challenger nodded slowly, processing the moment. His pride wasn't shattered, it was restructured. He realized now that Bruce hadn't been breaking the rules of fighting. He had been ignoring the unnecessary ones. Around them, the mood shifted. The whispers were gone. The smirks had vanished. The air felt heavier, not with tension, but with reflection. Some of the older fighters looked unsettled, not because they had been embarrassed, but because they sensed change, and change threatens comfort. Others looked intrigued, their rigid certainty cracking just enough to let curiosity through. Bruce turned slightly, addressing the room without raising his voice. "Styles are tools," he continued, "not cages." A few men nodded without even realizing they were doing it. He explained no further. He didn't need to. Over-explanation would have cheapened the lesson. Bruce Lee understood something most teachers forget: the body learns faster than the mind. The challenger stepped back into the circle, no longer as an opponent, but as a witness. He had offered 10 seconds with confidence. He had lost in less than one. Time wasn't the point anymore. The point was clarity. If that line gave you chills, tap like and comment truth below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more legendary moments like this. Fire. Bruce didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He didn't claim victory. He simply stood there, relaxed and present, as if the moment had been inevitable rather than impressive. To him, it wasn't about proving he was better. It was about proving what was real. And for the first time that day, everyone in that room understood the difference. No applause followed the exchange. No cheers broke the silence. No one felt the need to announce what had just happened. There was only respect. It settled over the room slowly, like dust after a sudden impact, quiet, unavoidable, and impossible to ignore. The kind of respect that isn't given out of excitement, but out of understanding. Every man there knew that clapping would have cheapened the moment. This wasn't entertainment. It was recognition. The same men who had mocked Bruce Lee minutes earlier now stood still, their expressions unreadable but their posture changed. Arms that had been crossed in judgment slowly dropped to their sides. Chins that had been lifted in pride lowered just enough to signal humility. No one rushed to speak. They were replaying the moment in their heads, the step, the timing, the impossibly small margin between control and consequence. Many of them had trained for decades, yet they had just witnessed something they couldn't immediately categorize or explain. And that unsettled them. Not because Bruce had embarrassed them, but because he had shown them a version of fighting that existed beyond the boundaries they had built for themselves. An older master near the wall cleared his throat, then stopped. He thought better of speaking. Words felt inadequate. Another man bowed his head slightly, not formally, not ceremoniously, but instinctively. It wasn't planned. It simply felt right. Bruce noticed everything. He noticed the shift in energy. He noticed the quiet acceptance. But he didn't absorb it as praise. Respect, to Bruce Lee, was not something to collect. It was something to pass through without attachment. He had learned long ago that ego could grow just as easily from admiration as from insult. One of the younger fighters finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "What you did," he began, then paused. "That wasn't against tradition." Bruce looked at him and nodded gently. "It's built on it," he said. "But it doesn't stop there." That was when it clicked. Bruce Lee wasn't breaking tradition. He was evolving it. He wasn't discarding the past. He was refining it, stripping away what no longer served reality. He understood that tradition was meant to guide growth, not freeze it in place. When rules stop adapting, they stop protecting truth. The men in the room began to see their own training differently. Forms they had practiced endlessly weren't wrong, but they weren't complete. Techniques they relied on weren't useless, but they weren't absolute. Bruce had shown them that fighting wasn't about preserving shapes. It was about preserving function. A few fighters stepped forward, not aggressively, but respectfully. Questions formed, not as challenges, but as curiosity. How did he train his timing? How did he read intention so quickly? How did he stay so relaxed under pressure? Bruce answered simply. "Remove what doesn't work," he said. "Keep what does." No lecture. No superiority. Just clarity. The challenger, now silent, stood off to the side, his earlier confidence transformed into thoughtful humility. He wasn't ashamed. In fact, he looked relieved to have encountered something real, something that cut through illusion. The room felt different now. Not divided by styles. Not separated by hierarchy. United by understanding. Bruce adjusted his jacket and took a step back, signaling the moment was over. He hadn't come to dominate the room or convert anyone. He had come to demonstrate truth, and truth had done the rest. As the men slowly dispersed, one thing was clear to all of them. They had not just met a skilled fighter. They had met a man who understood movement, timing, and reality at a level most only talk about. And from that moment on, Bruce Lee's name would no longer be spoken with doubt in that circle. It would be spoken with respect. Bruce Lee was never trying to prove he was a fighter. He didn't step into that room seeking validation, applause, or approval from men who believed titles defined truth. He wasn't interested in convincing anyone with words, credentials, or history. He was proving something far more important. That real strength doesn't need permission. Bruce understood a lesson many never learn. The loudest people in the room are rarely the most capable. True ability moves quietly. It doesn't argue with doubt. It doesn't waste energy defending itself. It waits for the right moment, then reveals itself through action. When people doubted him, Bruce didn't correct them. When they underestimated him, he didn't protest. When they mocked him, he didn't react. He let reality do the talking. And that's the difference between confidence and ego. Ego demands recognition. Confidence doesn't care if it's seen. The men in that room learned something that day that had nothing to do with martial arts alone. They learned that skill without humility is fragile, and tradition without evolution becomes a cage. Bruce Lee didn't reject discipline. He mastered it so completely that it became invisible. That's why his power felt unsettling. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't desperate to be acknowledged. It was honest. In life, you will meet people who tell you that you don't belong, that you're not qualified, that you're not real enough because you don't fit their expectations or follow their rules. They'll measure you using standards that protect their comfort, not the truth. When that happens, remember Bruce Lee. Don't argue with them. Don't explain yourself. Don't chase approval. Let your results speak. Silence paired with skill is one of the most powerful combinations in the world. It disarms critics, humbles doubters, and exposes empty confidence without ever raising its voice. When you move with purpose and discipline, no one can deny what they see, even if they don't like it. Bruce Lee's legacy isn't just about speed, strength, or technique. It's about clarity. Clarity of mind. Clarity of movement. Clarity of self. He showed us that the strongest person in the room doesn't need to dominate it. Sometimes, all it takes is one quiet moment of truth to change how everyone sees the world. If you believe silence plus skill equals real power, like this video, subscribe for more legendary stories, and comment "discipline" below. Respect to everyone watching with a warrior mindset. Folded hands fire.